Margaret Jane's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter for the 20th time since leaving Boston, her gaze drifting beyond the rattling train window to the endless Kansas prairie stretching toward the horizon. 1872 had been a year of endings and beginnings, the ending of her father's life, the beginning of her desperate correspondence with a cattle rancher named Owen Dawson, and now, the ending of her old life as she journeyed west to marry a man she'd never met. The conductor called out Newton, Kansas. Next stop, and Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. After 3 days of travel, she had finally reached her destination. She tucked the letter into her reticule and gathered her belongings, which consisted of one trunk and a small carpetbag. All her worldly possessions, everything that remained after settling her father's debts, fit into these 2 containers. The train slowed with a hiss of steam and screeching of metal, finally lurching to a stop at the Newton station. Margaret stood, smoothed her travel-worn navy blue dress, and took a deep breath. She was 22 years old and about to meet the man who would be her husband by this time tomorrow. Newton was nothing like Boston. As she stepped onto the platform, Margaret was struck by the rawness of the frontier town. A single dirt street lined with wooden buildings stretched before her. Men in dusty clothes and wide-brimmed hats lounged outside what appeared to be a saloon, while women in calico dresses hurried about their business. "Miss Jane," a deep voice called. Margaret turned to see a tall man striding toward her. He wore a faded red shirt and denim trousers tucked into scuffed boots. A tan Stetson sat atop his head, shadowing eyes as blue as the Kansas sky. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but his features were strong and weathered by sun and wind. "Mr. Dawson?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the commotion of the station. He nodded, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair. "Owen Dawson, madam. Welcome to Kansas." His eyes assessed her, not unkindly but with a frankness that made her cheeks burn. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, clutching her carpetbag tighter. "Let me get your trunk," he said, reaching for the luggage the porter had set on the platform. He lifted it easily as if it weighed nothing at all. "Wagons this way." Margaret followed him through the crowd, struggling to keep up with his long strides. She had imagined this moment countless times during the journey west, but now that it had arrived, she felt tongue-tied and awkward. The wagon was simple but sturdy, with a team of 2 strong horses waiting patiently. Owen loaded her trunk into the back, then offered his hand to help her climb onto the wooden seat. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip gentle yet firm. "It's about an hour's ride to my place," he said as he settled beside her and took up the reins. "Hope you don't mind the dust." "Not at all," she replied, though in truth, she had never experienced anything like the grit that seemed to permeate everything in this place. They set off down the main street, passing the general store, a blacksmith shop, and what appeared to be a small church before the buildings gave way to open country. The vastness of the landscape was both terrifying and exhilarating. In Boston, buildings hemmed you in on all sides. Here, there was nothing but space and sky. "Your letters didn't say much about what brought you west," Owen said after they'd traveled in silence for several minutes. Margaret considered how much to reveal. "My father passed away 6 months ago. He had gambling debts I didn't know about. When the creditors came, they took almost everything." Owen nodded, his expression somber. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she replied. "I saw your advertisement in the newspaper, a rancher seeking a bride. It seemed providential. And your family. They didn't object to you coming all this way to marry a stranger." "I have no family left," she admitted. "My mother died when I was 14. No siblings. A few distant cousins who offered no help when father died." Owen's hands tightened on the reins. Well, you won't be alone anymore. The simple statement brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. Your letters mentioned you've been ranching for 5 years. That's right. Came out here after the war with nothing but determination and a bit of saved pay. Started with 10 acres and 3 cows. Now I've got 150 acres and 40 head of cattle. That's impressive, she said, meaning it. It's a good life, but a hard one, he warned. Not like city living. I'm prepared to work hard, Mr. Dawson. Owen, he corrected. If we're to be married tomorrow, you might as well use my Christian name. Owen, she repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. And you should call me Margaret. They fell into another silence, but this one felt more companionable. The wagon rocked over the uneven prairie, and Margaret found herself studying her future husband's profile. His nose had been broken at some point, and there were lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. There it is, he said eventually, pointing ahead. Dawson Ranch. The homestead was modest but neat. A one-story house built of sturdy logs sat in the shadow of a large barn. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on rolling hills. It wasn't grand, but it had a solidity to it that spoke of permanence and care. Owen helped her down from the wagon, then retrieved her trunk. I'll show you around, then let you get settled. Pastor Miller will be here at noon tomorrow for the ceremony, if that suits you. Margaret nodded, her throat suddenly dry. This was all happening so quickly. The interior of the house was simple but clean. A main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a stone fireplace at one end. A kitchen took up the rear of the house, and 2 doors led to what she assumed were bedrooms. This will be your room tonight, Owen said, carrying her trunk into the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. After tomorrow, well. He cleared his throat, a flush creeping up his neck. I mean to say we can share the larger room. Of course, Margaret replied, her own cheeks heating. They had discussed the practical aspects of marriage in their letters, but standing here in his home made it all suddenly, alarmingly real. I'll let you rest, he said. Been a long journey. Supper in an hour. That would be lovely, thank you. Left alone, Margaret sank onto the narrow bed and finally allowed her tears to fall. Not tears of regret or fear exactly, but of the overwhelming reality of her situation. She had left everything she knew to marry a stranger in a land as foreign to her as the moon. After allowing herself a brief cry, she washed her face in the basin provided, unpacked a few essentials, and changed into a fresh dress, one of only 3 she owned. The blue gingham wasn't fashionable by Boston standards, but it was clean and presentable. When she emerged, she found Owen busy in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up as he tended to something on the stove. Can I help? She offered. Almost done, he replied. Just a simple stew and biscuits. The tantalizing aroma made Margaret's stomach growl embarrassingly loud. Owen glanced at her and smiled for the first time, transforming his serious face. Guess you're hungry, he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The food on the train was rather dreadful, she admitted. Owen ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed them on the table, along with a plate of golden brown biscuits. Margaret sat where he indicated, surprised to find the meal looked and smelled delicious. This is wonderful, she said after her first bite. You're quite the cook. Had to learn, he said with a shrug. Been on my own since I was 16. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Margaret worked up the courage to ask, will you tell me more about yourself? Your letters were informative but brief. Owen set down his spoon. Not much to tell. Born in Pennsylvania. Fought for the Union, came west afterward looking for a fresh start. I'm 30 now, never been married, no family to speak of. And what do you expect of a wife? She asked directly, needing to know. He considered her question carefully. Companionship, help with the ranch. Eventually, children, if we're blessed that way. He paused. What do you expect of a husband? The question surprised her. Respect, kindness, partnership. Owen nodded. Seems reasonable. After supper, Owen insisted on washing the dishes despite Margaret's protests. You've had a long day, he said firmly. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be busy. In her small room, Margaret changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. It was so different from the city noises she was accustomed to. She slept fitfully, waking at dawn to the sound of Owen moving about the house. Dressing quickly, she found him preparing breakfast eggs, bacon, and more of those delicious biscuits. Good morning, he said. Sleep well. Well enough, thank you, she replied, though the dark circles under her eyes likely told a different story. After breakfast, Owen excused himself to tend to the livestock, leaving Margaret alone to prepare for her wedding. She unpacked her best dress, a pale yellow cotton with lace trim, and did her best to style her chestnut hair into something presentable. At precisely noon, a wagon pulled up outside. Owen, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt and string tie, escorted Pastor Miller inside. The pastor was a kindly older man with white hair and spectacles who greeted Margaret warmly. The ceremony was brief, but solemn. Margaret repeated her vows in a clear voice, surprising herself with her steadiness. When Owen slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, he explained she felt a curious mix of trepidation and hope. You may kiss your bride, Pastor Miller said, and Owen leaned forward to place a gentle, chaste kiss on Margaret's lips. It was over in an instant, but the warmth of his mouth lingered. Pastor Miller stayed for the simple wedding meal Owen had prepared, then departed with promises to see them in church on Sunday. And then they were alone, husband and wife, yet still strangers. I have a wedding gift for you, Owen said, retrieving a package from a shelf. It's not much, but I thought you might like it. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of pencils. I noticed you writing in a similar book on the train platform, he explained. Thought you might need a new one. The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Margaret deeply. Thank you. It's perfect. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of small talk and shared chores. As dusk fell, the inevitable moment arrived when they must retire for the night. Owen showed her to the master bedroom, which boasted a large bed with a handmade quilt. I'll give you privacy to change, he said, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Margaret changed into her nightgown with trembling hands. She was a married woman now, with all that entailed. When Owen returned, wearing only trousers and an undershirt, she felt her breath catch. I won't rush you, he said quietly, seeming to read her anxiety. We have time to get to know each other better. Relief washed over her. Thank you, she whispered. They lay side by side in the darkness, not touching, the space between them both vast and infinitesimal. Good night, Margaret, Owen said softly. Good night. Husband, she replied, testing the word. The first light of dawn found Margaret already awake, having slept surprisingly well despite her nerves. Owen's side of the bed was empty, and she could hear him moving about in the kitchen. Dressing quickly, she joined him. Morning, he said, handing her a cup of coffee. I thought we'd have breakfast, then I could show you around the ranch properly. I'd like that, she replied, accepting the cup gratefully. After a hearty breakfast, Owen gave her a tour of the property. The barn housed 6 horses, including the pair that pulled the wagon and Owen's personal mount, a magnificent chestnut stallion named Rusty. Behind the barn was a chicken coop with a dozen laying hens, and beyond that, a small vegetable garden. It's not producing much yet, Owen admitted. "I'm not much of a gardener." "I could help with that," Margaret offered. "I've never had a garden, but I've read books about horticulture." Owen smiled. "Books, huh? Well, we can learn together." As they walked toward the cattle pasture, Margaret gathered her courage. "There's something I should tell you," she said. "Something I didn't mention in my letters." Owen stopped walking, turning to face her with concern. "What is it?" I don't know how to cook," she admitted, the confession rushing out of her. Or do any of the things a rancher's wife should know how to do. I was raised with servants who handled those tasks. I can play the piano and speak French and recite poetry, but I've never made a meal or mended a shirt in my life." She expected anger or disappointment, but to her surprise, Owen merely shrugged and said, "Good thing I can do both of those things." Margaret stared at him. "You're not upset. Why would I be? You've been honest. Besides, you can learn if you want to or not." "I've been taking care of myself for years. But I want to contribute, to be a real partner," she insisted. Owen's expression softened. "You will be. Maybe not in the ways you expected, but we'll figure it out together." His acceptance of her shortcomings lifted a weight from Margaret's shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Owen rose before dawn to tend to the livestock, returning for breakfast, which he continued to prepare. Margaret insisted on learning, watching carefully as he mixed biscuit dough or fried bacon to a perfect crispness. Her first attempt at cooking ended with burned cornbread and tears of frustration, but Owen ate it anyway, claiming he liked it crunchy. Her second attempt was more successful, a passable stew that Owen praised extravagantly. In turn, Owen began teaching her to ride. Margaret had never been on a horse before, and she was terrified of the gentle mare he selected for her. "She's the sweetest thing on 4 legs," he assured her, helping her into the saddle. "Daisy wouldn't hurt a fly." Margaret clung to the saddle horn, certain she would fall, but Owen led the horse slowly around the corral, his hand steady on the bridle. By the end of the first lesson, she had stopped trembling. By the end of the week, she could sit properly and guide Daisy with the reins. "You're a natural," Owen told her, his pride evident. "Hardly," Margaret laughed, "but I'm trying." As May turned to June, the Kansas heat intensified. Margaret found herself adapting to the rhythm of ranch life. She took over the care of the chicken coop and expanded the vegetable garden. Her cooking improved gradually, though Owen still handled the more complex meals. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Owen asked, "Are you happy here, Margaret?" She considered the question carefully. "I'm content," she answered honestly. "It's different from anything I ever imagined for myself, but not in a bad way." Owen nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. "It'll get easier." "It already has," she assured him. That night, when they retired to bed, Owen reached for her hand in the darkness. It was the first time he had initiated any physical contact beyond the necessary. Margaret's pulse quickened as his thumb traced circles on her palm. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes," she whispered. He drew closer, and in the soft glow of moonlight through the window, she could see the question in his eyes. She answered by leaning forward to press her lips against his. Their first night together, as true husband and wife, was awkward but tender. Owen was gentle and patient, guiding her through the unfamiliar intimacy with whispered reassurances. Afterward, she lay in his arms, feeling strangely both vulnerable and safe. "You all right?" he murmured against her hair. "Yes," she replied, surprised to find it was true. As summer progressed, their relationship deepened. Margaret discovered Owen had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed. He learned that she loved to read and had a gift for storytelling, often entertaining him with tales from the books she'd read back in Boston. In July, Owen announced he needed to make a cattle drive to Wichita with 3 neighboring ranchers. "I'll be gone about 2 weeks," he told her. "Will you be all right here alone?" The question would have terrified her 2 months ago, but now she nodded confidently. "I can manage the chickens and the garden, and Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring farm said she'd check on me." Owen's relief was palpable. "I'll leave you the shotgun just in case. You know how to use it." "You can teach me before you go," she replied, surprising herself with her practicality. The night before his departure, they made love with a new urgency, as if sealing a promise between them. In the morning, Margaret rose early to prepare his favorite breakfast and pack food for his journey. "I'll be back before you know it," Owen said, kissing her goodbye. "Don't worry." But Margaret did worry, especially as the first week stretched into the second with no word. She kept busy, tending to her daily chores and using Owen's absence as an opportunity to practice her cooking. She managed not to burn anything, which she counted as progress. On the 15th day, when Owen was 3 days overdue, Margaret saddled Daisy and rode to the Peterson farm. Mrs. Peterson, a kind woman in her 50s, tried to reassure her. "Cattle drives often take longer than expected," she said. "All manner of things can cause delays. I'm sure he's fine." But Margaret saw the concern behind the older woman's eyes. That night, she barely slept, listening for the sound of hooves that didn't come. On the 18th day, just as Margaret was contemplating riding to Newton to telegraph the sheriff in Wichita, she heard a wagon approaching. Running outside, she saw not Owen but Mr. Peterson driving a buckboard with a figure lying in the back. Her heart nearly stopped until she realized the figure was moving. "Owen!" she cried, rushing forward. Mr. Peterson helped a pale, drawn Owen from the wagon. His right leg was splinted and he leaned heavily on the older man. "What happened?" Margaret demanded, taking Owen's other arm. "Stampede," Owen grunted as they helped him into the house. "Got trampled. Broke my leg." Would have been back sooner, but the doc in Wichita insisted I rest a few days before traveling. They got him settled on the bed, and Margaret thanked Mr. Peterson profusely for bringing her husband home. Once they were alone, she examined Owen more carefully. Besides the broken leg, he was covered in bruises, and a nasty gash on his forehead had been stitched. "You should have sent word," she scolded, fighting back tears of relief. "Tried to," he said wearily. "Telegraph line was down. I'm sorry, Margaret. I didn't mean to worry you." She brushed the hair from his forehead, her anger melting into concern. "Just rest now. I'll take care of everything." And she did. For the next 6 weeks, Margaret ran the ranch single-handedly while nursing Owen back to health. She enlisted the help of neighboring men for the heavier work, but she handled the daily chores herself. She rose before dawn to feed the livestock, spent the mornings tending to Owen, and the afternoons working in the garden or mending clothes, a skill she'd finally begun to master. Owen chafed at his confinement, but admitted her care was probably the reason he healed so quickly. The local doctor who came to check on him remarked that Margaret had a natural healing touch. By late August, Owen was able to move around with crutches, and by September, he was walking with just a slight limp. But something had changed between them. Margaret had discovered her own strength during his convalescence, and Owen had gained a new respect for his city-bred wife. "You saved this ranch," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, "and probably me too." Margaret shook her head. "I only did what needed doing." "Exactly," he said, taking her hand. "You didn't know how to cook or so when you came here, but you never once said something couldn't be done. You just figured it out." "I had a good teacher," she replied, squeezing his hand. As autumn painted the prairie in golds and ambers, Margaret realized she had fallen deeply in love with her husband. It wasn't the romantic love she'd read about in novels, but something stronger and more enduring, a love built on respect, partnership, and shared struggle. One crisp October morning, as they collected eggs together from the chicken coop, Owen suddenly said, "I've been thinking about expanding." "Expanding what?" Margaret asked, placing another egg in her basket. "The ranch. Johnson's place to the east is for sale. Another 100 acres, good grazing land. With the profit from this year's cattle drive, we could afford it." Margaret was touched by the "we." It was the first time Owen had included her in such a decision. "Do you think it's wise?" "I think it's an investment in our future," he replied. "In the family we might have someday." The mention of family made Margaret's heart skip. They hadn't discussed children, though it was understood they both wanted them eventually. "Then I think we should do it," she said decisively. Owen grinned, pulling her in for a kiss that tasted of promise and possibility. They purchased the Johnson property in November, and Owen immediately began making plans for spring planting and expanding their herd. Margaret, meanwhile, threw herself into preparing for winter, preserving vegetables from their garden and making sure their home was snug against the coming cold. The first snowfall came in early December, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wonderland. Margaret, who had never experienced a prairie winter, was enchanted by the beauty but sobered by the harsh realities of the cold. "Winters can be brutal out here," Owen warned. "Blizzards that last for days, temperatures that'll freeze the blood in your veins." But inside their home, they created a haven of warmth and light. In the evenings, Margaret would read aloud from one of the books Owen had surprised her with on a trip to Newton, while he whittled or mended tack. Sometimes they just talked, sharing stories of their lives before they met. Christmas was a simple but heartfelt celebration. Owen gifted Margaret with a beautiful woolen shawl he'd purchased months earlier and hidden away. Margaret presented Owen with a pair of leather gloves she'd painstakingly sewn herself, her first completed sewing project. "They're not perfect," she apologized as he examined the slightly uneven stitching. "They're perfect to me," he insisted, pulling them on. "Best gift I've ever received." New Year's Day of 1873 brought a surprise visitor, Pastor Miller, braving the snow to check on his parishioners. "Just making the rounds," he explained as Margaret welcomed him inside. "Making sure everyone's got what they need to get through the winter." Over coffee and the apple pie Margaret had managed to bake without disaster, the pastor shared news from town. A new schoolhouse was being built, set to open in the spring. The railroad was bringing more settlers west every month. Newton was growing. "We need good folks like you two to help build the community," Pastor Miller said. "Speaking of which, Mrs. Dawson, we're looking for someone to help teach reading at the new school. I remember you mentioned you were educated back east." Margaret glanced at Owen, surprised by the suggestion. "I've never taught before, but you love books," Owen pointed out, "and you're patient. You'd be good with children." The idea took root in her mind. "I could ride in twice a week, perhaps, once the weather improves." Pastor Miller beamed. "That would be wonderful." Just a few hours each time to start. After the pastor left, Margaret turned to Owen. "Did you mean what you said about teaching?" "I meant it," he affirmed. "You've got gifts that shouldn't be wasted. Besides, it would be good for you to have something of your own outside the ranch." His understanding moved her deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, Margaret whispered, "I have something to tell you." Owen propped himself up on one elbow. "What is it?" "I think. I'm quite certain, actually. We're going to have a baby." Owen's face transformed with joy. "A baby? When?" "Sometime in June, I believe," she said, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he said, voice thick with emotion. He gathered her close, pressing his face into her hair. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted." The remaining winter months passed in a blur of preparations. Owen expanded the small second bedroom to make room for a nursery, building a cradle in the evenings by the fire. Margaret sewed baby clothes and blankets, her needlework improving with each project. Spring's arrival brought renewed energy to the ranch. Owen hired 2 hands to help with the expanded property, allowing him to spend more time close to home as Margaret's pregnancy progressed. She began teaching at the new schoolhouse twice a week, finding unexpected fulfillment in helping the frontier children learn to read. In May, Newton hosted its first Founders' Day celebration. Despite her advancing pregnancy, Margaret insisted on attending. The town had transformed in the year since her arrival, with several new buildings and many more families. "Hard to believe I've only been here a year," she remarked as Owen helped her down from the wagon. "Feels like you've always been here," he replied, offering his arm. The celebration featured a picnic, games for the children, and dancing. Margaret couldn't participate in the more vigorous activities, but enjoyed watching Owen demonstrate his surprising skill at the Virginia reel with Mrs. Peterson as his partner. "You never told me you could dance," she accused playfully when he returned to her side. "A man has to have some secrets," he teased. As they were preparing to leave, Margaret was startled to hear someone call her name. Turning, she found herself face to face with a ghost from her past, Richard Blackburn, a business associate of her father's from Boston. "Margaret Jane, as I live and breathe," the older man exclaimed. "What on earth are you doing in this God-forsaken place?" Before she could respond, Owen was at her side, his stance protective. "This God-forsaken place is our home," he said coolly, "and it's Margaret Dawson now." Richard's eyes widened as he took in Margaret's condition and the man beside her. "I see," he said, his tone dismissive. "Well, it's quite the change from Beacon Hill, isn't it?" "A change for the better," Margaret replied firmly. "What brings you to Kansas, Mr. Blackburn?" "Railroad business," he said vaguely. "Merely passing through. I must say your father would be shocked to see you like this." The mention of her father stung, but Margaret lifted her chin. "My father left me with nothing but debts. Owen has given me everything that matters: a home, a future, and love." Richard seemed taken aback by her forthright response. "Well, I wish you well," he said stiffly before turning away. On the ride home, Margaret was quieter than usual. Owen gave her space until they were nearly at the ranch, then asked gently, "You all right?" "Yes," she said after a moment. "It was just strange seeing someone from before, like looking at a different life. Do you ever regret it?" Owen asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Leaving all that behind," Margaret turned to him, placing her hand on his arm. "Not for a single moment." The baby came 2 weeks early on a sweltering June day. Margaret's labor was long and difficult, with the midwife from town shaking her head with concern as hours stretched into the night. Owen paced outside their bedroom, terror gripping his heart each time he heard Margaret cry out. When the midwife finally called him in near dawn, he found his wife pale and exhausted but smiling triumphantly. In her arms was a tiny bundle with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your son," Margaret whispered. Owen's hands trembled as he took the infant. The boy was small but perfect, with Margaret's chin and what looked like Owen's nose. "He's beautiful," he managed to say through the lump in his throat. "What shall we call him?" "I thought perhaps William, after your father," Owen nodded, too overcome to speak. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, cradling his son in one arm while reaching for Margaret's hand with the other. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For answering my advertisement. For taking a chance on me. For this life we've built." Margaret smiled tiredly. "I think we've both done rather well for ourselves, don't you?" Little William thrived, growing stronger each day. Margaret recovered slowly from the difficult birth, but by August, she was able to resume most of her duties. Owen insisted she continue teaching once she felt strong enough, arranging for Mrs. Peterson to watch William on those days. The first year of William's life passed in a blur of milestones: his first smile, first tooth, first steps. Owen proved to be a natural father, patient and loving. He would often carry William around the ranch in a sling he'd fashioned, pointing out animals and plants to the fascinated baby. Margaret's cooking skills had improved to the point where she could prepare most meals without disaster, though Owen still handled the bread baking, claiming it was therapeutic. Her sewing had progressed from rudimentary to competent, and she took pride in the clothes she made for her family. In the spring of 1874, just before William's first birthday, a letter arrived from Boston. It was from a lawyer representing Richard Blackburn, who had apparently died of a heart attack shortly after his trip west. "He left you something," Owen said, puzzled as he read the letter. "A substantial sum of money. Apparently he felt guilty about some business dealings with your father." Margaret was stunned. "How substantial?" Owen showed her the figure and her eyes widened. "Good Lord, that's enough to—" "To what?" Owen prompted when she trailed off. "To build a proper house," she said decisively. "Don't misunderstand, I love our home, but with this money we could build something that would last generations, something for William and any brothers or sisters he might have." Owen considered the idea. "It's your money. You should use it however you want." "It's our money," she corrected him, "and I want us to decide together." They spent the summer planning their new home, a 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and even a small library for Margaret's growing collection of books. Construction began in the fall and continued through the mild winter. By the time William turned 2, the family had moved into their new home. The old cabin wasn't torn down but converted into a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, who now numbered 4. "It's strange," Margaret remarked one evening as they sat on their new porch, watching William chase fireflies in the yard. "If my father hadn't gambled away our fortune, if I hadn't been desperate enough to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride, I'd never have known any of this happiness." "Life has a way of taking us where we need to go," Owen replied, his arm around her shoulders, "even when we think we're lost." In the summer of 1875, Margaret discovered she was expecting their second child. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and on a crisp March morning in 1876, she gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth. With 2 small children, a thriving ranch, and Margaret's part-time teaching, life was busier than ever. Yet somehow, they managed to find balance. Owen insisted Margaret continue her work at the school, recognizing how much fulfillment it brought her. "You weren't meant to be just a rancher's wife," he told her. "You were meant to be Margaret Dawson, with all the talents and gifts that entails." As the years passed, the Dawson ranch grew and prospered. They added a 3rd child, another son named James, in 1878. The town of Newton expanded as well, becoming a hub for cattle shipping and drawing more settlers to the area. By 1882, 10 years after Margaret had first stepped off the train in Newton, their homestead had transformed into one of the most successful ranches in the county. The original 150 acres had grown to over 500, with a herd of nearly 200 cattle and a dozen fine horses. On their 10th anniversary, Owen presented Margaret with a gift, a beautiful piano for their parlor. "You mentioned once that you played," he explained. "I thought it was time you had one again." Margaret was speechless. The instrument must have cost a small fortune and been incredibly difficult to transport to the ranch. "How did you manage this?" "I have my ways," he said mysteriously. Play something for us." Her fingers were rusty from a decade without practice, but the memory remained. She played a simple melody, and soon William and Elizabeth were dancing around the parlor while little James clapped his hands in delight. Owen watched them all, his face reflecting the same wonder Margaret felt. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked quietly. "That first day when I met you at the train station," Margaret shook her head. "I hoped for security, maybe companionship I never dreamed of." She gestured to encompass their beautiful home, their children, the life they'd built together. "All of this. Neither did I," Owen admitted. "I just knew I was tired of being alone." "Well, you'll never be alone again," Margaret promised, rising from the piano bench to kiss him. "Not as long as I have anything to say about it." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch swing, a tradition they'd maintained through the years. The Kansas night was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant coyotes, the air sweet with the scent of Margaret's rose garden. "Do you remember what you said when I confessed I couldn't cook or sew?" Margaret asked, leaning her head against Owen's shoulder. "Something about how it was a good thing I could do both," he recalled with a chuckle. "You know, I can do both those things now," she pointed out. "Quite well, in fact." "That you can," he agreed. "And I've learned a few things myself over the years, how to be a father, how to love someone more than I thought possible." Margaret smiled in the darkness. "We've taught each other well." "We've got a lifetime more learning ahead of us," Owen said, pulling her closer. And as the stars shone down on the home they'd built together, Margaret knew it was true. Their story, which had begun with a desperate advertisement and a leap of faith, was still being written. There would be more challenges, more joys, more lessons to learn. But they would face them as they had faced everything else together, with love and determination, building a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the years that followed, the Dawson children grew tall and strong, each finding their own path. William developed his father's affinity for ranching, while Elizabeth revealed a brilliant mind for business and numbers. Young James showed artistic talent, filling sketchbooks with drawings of prairie life. Margaret continued teaching until the school committee appointed her headmistress in 1890, a position she held with distinction for 15 years. Owen served on the town council and helped establish Newton's first bank, though he always maintained that his greatest achievement was the family and home he'd built with Margaret. And throughout it all, they never forgot how their unlikely love story began with a bride who couldn't cook or sew, and a cowboy who simply shrugged and said it didn't matter. For in the end, it was never about those skills at all, but about building a life of love, respect, and partnership on the wild Kansas frontier.